glad you're here. What I like to talk, my name's Jim Baumgratz from St. Mary's. And usually how I want to start out is people want to know how I got involved in murder. Now I don't.
The cops do too.
Yeah. I don't do this full time, although I'm trying to transition into it full time. But basically, always had an interest in crime, and growing up, I guess you hear the stories from your parents, and my dad would always tell me about a murder in Johnsonburg, where the guy was cut up in 11 pieces. I don't know how, let me put this over this. The guy was cut up in 11 pieces, stuffed in a pickle barrel, and they called it a clear case of suicide. So you're growing up and you think, well, is that really true? You know, did that really happen? And you know, I always wanted to know, now back in the late 70s, 80s, there was crime shows on TV, but not like there is now. Now you got Investigation Discovery, all that. But then I started going to a camp as a teenager up on West Rick Road. You're coming from St. Mary's, and the guy that owned the camp, Beagle Lawman, is dead now, but he was a big BSer. You know, but he'd take out the porch of his camp and he'd say, listen to that hollow over there. Can you hear the pigs squeal? Of course, you know, young teenager, so you know, you could think you could hear pigs squealing. And he says, well, over there, the Henry, the guy's name was Henry Hubbabaker, murdered a guy named Knockway, and he fed him to the pigs. You know, so there was another story. I said, well, is that true? First thing, knowing the guy that owned the camp, you know, like to spin tales, you know. So I always wondered if that was true. So moving up into, you know, then you see the occasional homicide. I was always interested in that. I went to school, to college for business administration, political science, and I finished as a drug and alcohol counselor, but I don't do that, you know. But I always took criminal justice courses. I wanted to be an attorney, but children get in the way. Situations happen, so I never, you know, went to law school. I did take the LSATs, but you know, that would have been my dream. So in moving on about 1998, me and a business partner, we bought this old hotel in Johnsburg, the Johnsburg Hotel. And rumors over the years, you know, Al Capone stayed there. There was murders in the hotel, a lot of mystery, and a lot of reputed ties to the Black Hand. That's kind of my family, so that really wasn't totally true. But everybody told me what I was going to do is reopen the bar room as called Capone's. And everybody said, well, you got to get the book Tiger at the Bar because the hotel's in there and that'll help you come up with a theme and you can spin tales, you know, at the bar. But to find this book was practically impossible. I think you could find one on eBay back then. Maybe they were like $600, and I couldn't understand, you know, what was in that book that was so intriguing. What I did was I finally the girl I was engaged to at that time, mother had a copy that was ripped up, and you know, a dog got to it or whatever. But you know, here I was looking for the book, and she had it. I ended up actually going to the library in St. Mary's. It took 8 months for me to get the copy for somebody to borrow it. Long story short, I got the book. The hotel's not in here, but I got the idea to reprint it, and so I reprinted that back in '99. And reading the stories, you know, Emporium's in here, a lot about Bradford, Elk County, Johnsburg, Punxsutawney, down by Pittsburgh. And what it's about is this gentleman named Charles Margiotti, who was an attorney from Punxsutawney. and he was actually the attorney you'd go to if you got accused of homicide. You know, he thousands of cases, he was the defense attorney, and he never lost a man to the death penalty. What he does, he was such a good defense attorney. He's actually the one that came up with the saying. He actually said it in Ridgeway Courthouse. I don't know if you ever hear this, sometimes you hear this, but in a court, he was questioning a witness, and he said, you know, have you stopped beating your wife? Now see, the witness couldn't say, well, yes, because then he would be admitting that he did beat his wife, and he couldn't say no, because then he's still beating his wife. So I mean, that's how good of an attorney he was, that he could discredit anybody's witnesses. But that started the book, or started my really interest in it. And what I thought was, there had to have been a lot more local cases. And in around year 2002, I went from I was in between jobs, between sales and marketing, and so I went to the Elk County Courthouse. I had time, and I started researching. Back in the day, there was a court called Lawyer and Terminer Court, and that handled all felonies. So to go through those court books takes forever, because everybody that was charged with a felony's name's in there, and you have to decide you have to see if they're charged with homicide or horse thievery or rape or whatever, and that's where I started finding cases. I usually stop around 1960. I don't go beyond 1960. But in Elk County back then, I pulled up 150 cases before 1960. And I found out, the pickle barrel was true. Okay, he really was, Dominic Scopoletti, he really was cut up in 11 pieces, so my dad was right. This is a picture of his remains that was in the pickle barrel. And now with him, with Dominic, I found out that was true. I found out the Pigpen murder was true too. So actually they weren't BSing me all those years, they were telling me the truth. Dominic Scopoletti here, he was the king of the bootleggers in 1926 in Johnsburg. And he had nice suits, brand new cars, no job, but he did the bootleg. They found him stuffed in a barrel, and he was cut in 11 pieces, still had his suit on, and my dad said, well, it was called a suicide.
Yeah, right.
Ran into the knife 11 times.
Oh yeah.
He must have pissed somebody off.
Now the reason I did find out, I talked to I don't have a picture. This was the county detective back in Elk County detective back in the 20s, 30s. His name was Leo Werner. They called him the Dutchman. Now, he was German. Scopoletti was Italian. And they said whenever a case happened in the immigrant community, whether it was Italians, whether it was Hungarians, he knew the first thing they would do was clam up, and they went and talk to him. So they said what he used to say, Werner, was whenever there was a murder like that, he'd put his hands up and say, clear case of suicide. So actually that's where it came, because he thought, it'd be worthless for me to investigate because I'm not going to find out who did it. But he actually was a very good detective. And at the time this happened in 1926, Emporium was involved because of the bootlegging trade. There was 11 murders, knockoffs, I should say. Emporium, Olean, Bradford, Warren, Johnsonburg, Ridgeway, and there was a war going on between the bootleggers. And so of course everybody assumed, well, he was part of it. He was the king of the bootleggers. 10 other people already murdered, he's number 11 on the list. But but the other murders were just a single bullet wound to the head. He was cut up in 11 pieces, so that tells you it was rage. Now what Leo Werner figured out was this was Scopoletti's bodyguard. Now he's pictured here in a band uniform. His name was Marchese, and he was the bodyguard of Scopoletti. Back in those days, they would have the wake often at the house, you know, where he had lived, and Marchese was there that night during the wake. The day after they found the body, he put back together. He walked outside, said he was going to have a cigarette, and he disappeared. He was never seen again. So of course, then people were like, "Well,
What were his pieces are?
yeah." Right. However, Werner figured it out that Scopoletti was quite a ladies' man also, and had been messing around with Marchese's wife.
Oh, that'll do it.
Yeah. So. Now I can't prove that. Nobody can prove that. But what
Especially back in them days.
yeah, what he did was, you know, he did it. I'm going to say that more like it, and he ended up moving to Chicago. Now he waited until Werner retired in the 30s. Werner went. He got a job at the Stackwell Corporation. He became their chief detective, and he moved back to the area, changed his name, and he lived the rest of his life in this area. But that's just. But I guess the point of the story is what my dad had told me was true. You know, the suicide came from Detective Warner. You know, he would say it's a clear case suicide because he wasn't going to get the truth. But he figured out who did it. It just could never be proven. So, and then the Pigpen murder, that was a real case. That's also in Volume 1. Up on West Creek Road, there was a guy named Henry Hubblebaker. I don't have a picture of him with me. And when he was a teenager, he was involved in a mine cave-in. So he suffered injuries to his head, so that kind of made him goofy, I will say. You know what I mean?
I know a lot of them.
Yeah, a lot of people like that. So little Henry moved to in a little shack down in West Creek. Moved a little shack down West Creek down by Swissmont, and if you know Swissmont, there used to be a little train station there. There used to be a big underground water trough. You know, used to fill up the trains, and this is in 1929. And a lot of people would go there that worked on a railroad, and they would go sleep in that train station. They would hear Henry, he was up in Sand Lake Hollow, so they had heard that he made alcohol. So a lot of them would go up there and they'd drink with him. A lot of times they wouldn't show up the next day. Back then, you know, it was pretty normal for immigrants that would work on a railroad or African Americans. If they didn't show up the next day, then they'd think, oh, he went back to the old country or he moved on. You know, it wasn't like today. It is like today where people just disappear. They don't come back to work, but they really disappeared back then. But nobody really thought anything weird about these people disappearing, these workers, these immigrants. Until a guy in St. Mary's, his name was Vincent Noctway. And deer season of 1929, he decided to go to, he had some friends that had camps, hunting camp down in West Creek, so he decided to go deer hunting, so he told his sister goodbye, I'm going deer hunting. He was never heard from again. So all of the the police and the county detectives and volunteers all went down. There was, they said, 3 feet, 4 feet of snow. They went tramping through the snow in Swissmont looking for this Noctway guy. One of Noctway's friends ran into Henry Hubblebaker. And as he's talking to him, he noticed, his hunting hat, hunting jacket. He saw a gold watch on him, and he thought, that and boots, and he was thinking, that's my buddy's stuff. That's Noctway's clothes, and Henry's wearing them. So he didn't say anything to him. He went to talk to the county detective, and they went to Henry's house, or shack, and lo and behold, they found, it was wintertime, so he didn't have time to cut up the body, but some of it had been fed to his pigs. Now this is 1929. They didn't find skulls, but they found other bones in the pig pen. Henry said it was animals, that he killed in the woods, and he fed them to his pigs. But they found a lot of stuff in his shack nice clothes, other jewelry, you know, like watches, that he wouldn't have been able to afford because he was a hermit. So they assumed there was much more, you know, many more victims of Henry. The thing with Henry, though, he was deemed insane, so there never was a trial. So none of this ever came out. You know, you can read it in the court records, but nothing ever came out. Nobody investigated it. Noctways, he's buried in St. Mary's. Henry's buried there too. He went to Warren State Hospital. He died there in 1954. He never said he murdered anybody else, or if he did, those records are gone. You know, so that turned out to be a true story also. You know. There's 25 murders in each book, so that's just 2 that came out of volume 1. Now, I started writing that 2002. I carried it around the hunting camp overseas with myself. Never finished it, and in 2018, or 2017 New Year's, I made a resolution. I actually followed through with it that I was going to actually write it, and I did write it in 2018, and that's just started the whole writing journey. I have like 400 to 500 cases right now that I'm researching, you know, each time. But I start in the courthouse. That's where I get the names, and you can read. And most of these are buried in the basements. In Warren, it's up on the 3rd floor of the courthouse, and that's where the heating unit is. So it's like 150 degrees, and you got to go through these old books, and they get full of dirt and, you know, dust. But that's, you know, and sometimes you can read the transcripts that are in there, and you'll see exactly what happened to the person. You know. Okay. All right, so that was volume 1. Just a little highlights there.
Do you follow up with newspaper articles too, or you just stick to the court records?
I do. I belong to newspaper archives. I belong to newspapers.com. I go to historical societies. I do talk to relatives. Ancestry.com, you can find a lot of information there. So I do all that, and then I put it together in a story. And you wouldn't think, like, these murders happened so long ago that there would, you know, there's nobody around that knows anything about it. I did learn a lesson, you know, from in this book. Now you'll never read it anywhere else, but there was a girl in Johnsonburg that her husband worked at the mill, and then they lived in a tenement, so she lived upstairs, and she had, I'm pretty sure, 5 kids, little kids, and she just had a newborn. She was only like 19, 20. Okay, so real good looking.
They start young.
Yeah, well, the husband was like 35. So he'd go to work. Now there's single tenants lived below, you know, and the house is still standing there. Well, one day the husband came home from the mill early, caught her in bed. Well, she was in bed with the young boy downstairs, and she pulled a gun out. She had a gun on her bed, you know, shot him. And in court, you could read the court transcript, and even in every account, you know, what she said was her husband left for work. This guy had come up there before and raped her and threatened her that he would hurt her babies if she told on him, okay? And then when the husband came back, he was raping her again, and she pulled the pistol out and killed him. Okay, so I wrote that whole story in there. A couple years ago, I was at the senior center in Johnsonburg, and I was talking about that case, and one lady raised her hand, and I said, yes, and she said, that's not what happened. And I said, oh.
That was a lady.
Yeah. Yeah, and I was thinking, well, how do you know, 1925 or 6? She said, well, I grew up, you know, in that neighborhood, she said, and my mother told me what really happened was she was having an affair with that guy, and the husband suspected it, and so he went off to work, and he watched the, you know, guy get out of up, downstairs, run up into the upstairs. He came back in to catch her in bed, and she got caught, so she pulled a pistol and shot the guy and killed, the guy. And she said he was raping her, and of course the husband says, that's the story you're sticking with? And so in reality, she murdered that guy.
Well, he didn't shoot her.
Right. Oh yeah. Well, they have talked to ancestors, of them. This guy here, he got murdered by the Black Hand in Johnsonburg, and the wife and child. Now this is in the 1920s also. The wife and child were so afraid they took off and they went back to Italy. So now there's all types of ancestors back there. So they got a hold of me. They sent me a lot of pictures of the family over there. It's real big now. And ordered a lot of copies, and they told me a few things that I didn't know, about that murder there. So I mean, the people do come and get a hold of me. A lot of times the stories that are told are not true. There's a partial truth to it. But, nobody wants to talk about having an ancestor that was a murderer, or they hear that their ancestor got murdered, but they don't always hear, it's the truth. So I am able to help them out on a lot of those cases. Now this one here. One thing I do, like the sad thing, and even in my new book there, is whenever children are involved. There's a bunch in this book, in all the books. And this one, I'd have to say this one has me the most intrigued. This little boy. I have a camp right around where he disappeared in Highland, Pennsylvania. And it's a very weird circumstance. But his name was Eddie. I don't know. Eddie, he was 9 years old, back in 1910. And it was the first day of fishing season. And this was in Lamont, Pennsylvania. It's in the middle of nowhere.
I know where it is.
You know it is? Okay.
Noble Falls.
Yep. The little Eddie, he went fishing with 3 older boys. They were like 12 to 14 years old. And they were told by their father, he was told by his father, be careful, there's a game warden out there, so I don't, or fish warden, so don't get caught. But they went fishing on this little stream, little trout stream, and after they were fishing for a couple hours, how they described it as a large dark figure come out of the woods. Now, it's more like it was a man, but it scared them. It started yelling at them and chasing them. The other 3 boys, being older, were able to run up the dirt road towards Lamont. The last they saw him, they turned around and the guy grabbed, little Eddie. Okay, and he's never been seen again. Brought in bloodhounds. 300 inmates from New York State Prison volunteered. They brought them down. There was over 1,000 people in Little Lamont looking for Eddie, and they never found a trace of him. The bloodhounds went right to the spot where the boys said they saw this guy grab him, and it was never seen again. Over the years, his father had some money, and his father followed up on every lead. There was in World War I, because this is 1910, so he was 9 years old, so he would have been draftable during World War I. A nurse at an Italian military hospital, originally from Butler, was working on a soldier that got injured, American soldier, and the American soldier said, my name's Eddie. I got too many names in my head here, though. My name's Eddie, and I've disappeared from Vermont. And now, see, this was all over the newspapers back then. So she was from Butler, Pennsylvania. She remembered the story, so she wrote a letter to her parents back in Butler and said, hey, Eddie's up here. you know, he's here in Italy. So the father, Eddie had another brother that was in the military in France during World War I. He went right away to Italy to this hospital. Military authorities went there to see if it was Eddie, and they've never found this person. So they think it might have been a hoax. He knew that this girl was from Butler. He obviously was from somewhere around Kane and thought he'd get some.
They didn't have DNA back then.
No, but he's never been found. On the same day, though, the weird part, 13 miles away in Ludlow, Pennsylvania, that's in this book, his story. Another little boy, 7 years old, went fishing with his buddy, and they went fishing. This is little windfall run that goes through Ludlow, and you can see it's not deep. He went fishing, and his friend went ahead to a bigger hole, and his friend came back, and he was gone. They never, you know, and they never found that boy either. That boy's father was very poor, so, but they still brought 1,000 people there, looked all over, you know, went through all these fishing holes, went into the bigger streams, they drug them, they detonated them, they never found that boy either. And I was up in a book signing up in Ludlow this past summer, and I met a guy who was related to the little boy in Lamont, or Ludlow. And he said all the way up till the 1980s, his aunt was consulting psychics to find out whatever happened
Oh,
to the
yeah?
person. So you know, like 80 years later, you know, they were still looking for these boys. But neither of the boys were found, so these are most really intriguing. I talked to a guy too this past summer. His grandfather went to school with little Eddie, and the 3 boys he was with, they thought those older boys, there was an accident, maybe they killed him, you know, and he buried him somewhere. And he said up in Lamont, they waited all those guys, all those years for those boys as they grew up to finally admit, hey, we did kill him, but they never did because they didn't, you know, so. That's just kind of, you know, some of the stuff out of volume 2. Also, that's volume 3. A little disorganized here today. Okay, where am I now? Okay, well, this is just a highlight of volume 3. Like I said, there's 25 stories in each one, but these 2 guys are, this is Patsy Banya and this is Frederick Rockwell. Now they're the only 2 guys that got hung in Elk County. They got hung on the same day. Rockwell's in, his story's in here, and then Banya's in 3, and I have him on the front. He's got a little evil eyes there, but his problem was alcohol. He was very mean too, and he didn't speak hardly any English. He ended up like shooting a guy, more than likely because he was intoxicated. Wasn't, you know, he was a very hated person. He lived in Claremont for a while. He actually, where he killed the man was in Brandy Camp over in Kersey area.
He got around.
Yeah, he got around. He had, you know, kids and a wife in Italy, which was common back then. They would come over here and then they would send money back. But he was sentenced to be hung. And Frederick Rockwell, we actually did a play about him. He was actually he was real young too. Nice kid, but in the 1890s, people would live out in the woods and they'd build their houses and, you know, just build them anywhere. They didn't really own the land. And he would go, or they would leave and they'd go hunting Potter County, whatever, for 6 months, and they'd come back, and oftentimes somebody went and moved into their shack and were squatting. Yeah, so you leave your house for a couple weeks, you come back, somebody took it over. A family of Lewis Haynes had moved into his shack when he came back. He went hunting up New York State, and he came back, and his family was living in there. Lewis Haynes, his wife, she had like 3 kids, and her brother was living in there. And instead of, fighting with him, he said, okay, the more the merrier, we'll all work together. Long story short, the wife, she was young and she was very good looking. Like I say, he was a single guy, 21, probably never had a girlfriend. He fell under her spells, and she said, if you really want me, you'll kill my husband, and then you can have me. And that's what he did. Of course, he got caught then, and he got caught actually for other reasons. They would go around at night, and they would, raid farmhouses, raid barns, steal horses, whatever they could do. And that's how he got caught, and then they kind of traced it back to when they found this body. It was burned up in a logging camp, and they finally figured out it was Lewis Haynes. But they both were sentenced to death on the same day in 1897. Kind of interesting is there's another guy that was also facing the death penalty on the same day in Elk County. And something that wouldn't be allowed today was the jurors went from his trial to the next guy's trial. So they jumped. So they heard this one, convicted him, put him to death, and then they were on a third trial. And what I think is they realized, we already put 2 to death, so they spared the third guy, who I think deserved it more because what he did was a lot more heinous. So these 2 gentlemen got hung on the same day in Elk County, and that's the only 2 that ever, got hung up there. They're buried in Montmorency Cemetery, Catholic cemetery, unmarked graves. I went there and met with the curator, and he showed me where there are, but he doesn't want me to tell because even though it's 100 and some years, he said there's people that are looking for their graves.
Oh, yeah, seen it up.
They might do something, so. Now he told me a lot of other stories up at that cemetery, but I'm not into ghosts or anything, so I try to avoid all that. I carry it
Me
across.
too, when I go up over there, I keep my going.
If you look on the left there,
Yeah,
well,
I know.
I'm not here talking about ghost stories, so, but what that gentleman's seen in there sometimes, I avoid that as much as I can, But I carry a cross because I don't want to get, because I spend a lot of time in cemeteries, so, even though it's hollow ground, there still are spirits, and I don't write about them. So. Okay, Rockwell. So that's like just a little idea what's in the first 3. Then I decided 2 years ago I have more to make more for Elk County, but I went to the McKean County Courthouse. Now I have 175 from there before 1960. So I decided to do a volume 1 of McKean County. What did I find there? Maybe I forgot. I know who he is, but that's not him. So I must have forgot him. I'll talk about him a little bit, but there's 25 murders in McKean County, all right? Now this gentleman, he's gonna be in my, the book I'm working on now. And what it's called is Missing in the Pennsylvania Wilds, okay? And it's all about, it's not about murder, really. And that's where I'll touch about this guy, this kid up in Potter County. It's about people who disappeared in Pennsylvania Wilds, including Emporium. Like, Emporium's most famous is Diana Miller, that disappeared down in Semahony back in 1986. this guy, I call him the Jimmy Hoffa of Bradford. And his name was Patsy Mussolino. He was a very big bootlegger and organized crime. Now, organized crime back in those days was called the Black Hand. There's a big difference between Black Hand and Mafia. Black Hand wasn't as organized. He almost died several times. If you look through the old archives, he was arrested constantly for bootlegging. But he mysteriously disappeared in 1925. And the last news, I mean, what would happen, his wife, he had like 11 kids. His wife would get telegrams saying, honey, I'm in Buffalo. I'll talk to you in 3 days. And then she'd get a telegraph from Philadelphia. Honey, I'm in Philadelphia. See you soon. And then last New York City, you know, honey, I'm now over here and I'll see you. And it was just somebody, whoever took him.
Yeah, because he couldn't be traveling that fast.
No. And he,
Not back in them days.
Jack Allison was the county detective in McKean County. And I do believe what happened was he was taken out on Lake Superior and weights were put on him and he was thrown overboard. So that's like an unsolved.
Fish bait.
Yeah, yeah, he was fish bait, is what happened, yeah. But you never crossed him, you know. There's some in here that from Bradford that were taken out, you know. One thing they did up there in Bradford and Olean, there was two different families fighting for control of the bootlegging trade. And they figured out in Olean that they would kill them in Olean and they'd take them across the Pennsylvania border and they'd dump them. And then the Bradford people started doing that too, so they'd dump them in Salamanca. That eliminated the Pennsylvania State Police from investigating.
Blame it on the Indians.
But they would, but they couldn't go across the border to investigate. And then the same thing, the New York police couldn't go over to
They didn't
Bradford.
have the FBI back then, because doesn't the FBI have authority to get involved in any?
No, they didn't get involved up there. It was kind of like, you know, local. No, I'm not saying the FBI wasn't there, but you never saw them around.
Wild
there,
West.
You know. They were in Buffalo, but the FBI was real fledgling then. They weren't involved. State police were involved, but they couldn't get across. You know, the county detectives in Olean talked to the county detectives in McKean, but a lot of the bodies that were found up there, I don't know who they were, because they would send messengers down from Buffalo. And they didn't like the message, they would take them out, shoot them in Bradford, and then they would take them and dump them in Salamanca. So they were like, well, we don't.
They're still doing that.
Yeah,
They
probably
are.
still are. And he had a lot to do with that, this guy, you know.
I think it's drugs now.
Drugs is what it is, oh yeah. Okay, I'll go into, now this is Emporium here.
Ooh, that's important.
That looks familiar.
That's Joe Pagano.
Yeah.
Now what he did was he drank too much whiskey. Now there's 5 have been hung in Cameron County, so you're a little more justice down here than there is in Elk County.
You couldn't get over the mountains.
Yeah. Now, I don't think, like today, you know, he would have obviously suffered the death penalty, but he drank too much whiskey. He was thrown out of a bar here. It's in the book, and innocent guy came outside he was shooting out in the street. Innocent guy walked out and said, hey, don't do that. He shot him in the heart, killed him. I think because he was an immigrant, didn't speak English, is probably why they hung him. He was hung in 1909. The last one that was hung in Cameron County before him was Orr Odell, who killed his wife. He'll be in the next book. But they hung him. He cried. You know, they helped him write a letter to his mother and his kids and that in Italy, and they hung the poor guy. But I'm kind of I believe in the death penalty, but there's so many cases of innocent people that were killed, that I could never trust the justice system back then, whether they were guilty or not. He was guilty, but he didn't even remember
I
doing
can't
it.
trust it today.
Right. You know.
There's a lot of should be a lot more people hung now. Because
Well, there's a lot more evidence today, but, you know, a lot
Sure,
of,
it takes 2 years to get to a trial.
a lot of the cases, you know, like, if you look, like, this is unsolved, you know, this
You
is
didn't have DNA back then.
unsolved,
That's what I
right?
said, they don't,
Fingerprints, they didn't have, this lady in Bradford, you can see a wound on her head there. She murdered her boyfriend in bed, but they didn't tend to convict women back then.
no, they didn't blame him for nothing.
She got away with it, you know. Now this guy, I just threw him on there because he's got that scary face, but, he's in the new book. He was, George Chapman, his name was, up towards, up above, Cottersport, and they called him the pretty please killer. And, alcohol. You know, he was drinking heavy. He wanted his new wife, to say pretty please. She wouldn't say it, so
You shot her.
he shot her.
Yeah, I don't blame him.
And then he remembered, he wasn't the swiftest tool in the shed, but he remembered his wife said, when I die, I want my puppy to go with me, so he took her puppy and shot
Shot him too.
Put it in her arms.
Well, he followed her request anyways.
And this is in the 40s. Now his limited understanding was what he thought was he would go to jail for a little bit and get out. And he kept saying, well, when are they gonna let me get out? Because I gotta get back to work. Yeah. So
He would have got out today.
right. Well, he got the death penalty, but successfully, appealed that, got life in prison. Life in prison didn't mean that back then. He was reading a Reader's Digest. He saw an attorney from Philadelphia that would get him, on parole, and he ended up getting parole, and he died in the 70s up in
That sounds familiar.
Roulette. Yeah, but like dangerous man on alcohol. There's four reasons usually for murder. The 4 L's: love, lust, loot, and loathing. So usually any murder you can find that'll fit love, lust, loot, or loathing. But I like to include alcohol because a lot of these murders.
Liquor.
Yeah,
There we go.
liquor. There we go. All right. So I'm not gonna say 5. But now, if you can't find, with taking the liquor out, you can't find that motive, then there's no crime, or it was a mistaken identity. And kind of the case in Ridgeway in the 80s, Mickey Buck, the guy's name was, still unsolved. They're still investigating it, but he was a 3rd shift foreman at motion control, and he walked out in a parking lot and he got shot. There was no love problems, there was no lust problems, there was no.
They don't have to be. Could have been dope problems.
Well, mistaken identity is what I think it was. The guy they think did it, he went home and committed suicide. And now, since it's an active investigation, I don't really get into this at all. But what turned out to be was he borrowed his friend's car that night.
Oh.
His friend was having an affair with the suspect's girlfriend.
Oh.
And then he also, not only did he borrow his friend's car that night, he covered his shift.
Oh.
So what they assumed was the guy were waiting to kill that guy that owned the car and was having the affair. This Mickey borrowed his car, went worked for him, come out of the factory, get in the car and shot him. And that would make sense, but that's kind of what they think happened. Here's another little boy. He's in the new book. His name was Harry Helschel. He was 10 years old from Brookville. Real mysterious that what happened to him. And then another thing on him is if you ever read John Benet Ramsey, to me this is pretty close to that.
Yeah.
What little Harry did was on a Sunday in April to warm up 1918. He went to Sunday school, and he came home, and his mother had lunch for him, and his little brother finished early, and he went out the backyard in a field on the left and was playing ball with his friends. Harry, since he was at church, he was a little bit later, finished his lunch. He didn't wear any shoes, he had bare feet. He went out the back to join his brother. in the backyard of their house, there's a little dip and there was a fence, and there was a hole cut in the fence. That's how they would get out and go play. Well, his father said, I saw little Harry, I talked to him in the backyard. This was on a Sunday. And about 1 o'clock, last he saw Harry was going through the fence. And he didn't see him again because he dipped down.
Mhm.
Like I said, though, the brother was playing with his friends on the left there in a field. On the right, there was a newly plowed field. They just plowed it up the day before. So Harry wasn't seen again. 5 o'clock on Sunday, that Sunday supper time, Harry didn't show back up, to his house. And the father and mother there and his brothers and that, and the father asked the little brother, did you play with Harry today? Do you know where he's at? And the brother said, no, I never saw him. He didn't come down to the field with us. No, it's kind of weird because the father assumed, well, then maybe he's at a neighbor's house and he's eating there. The father owned gas wells and he would work third shift. He'd go out and get the gas wells pumping and he'd come back at 7 in the morning. At 11 o'clock, Sunday night, the father left for work and Harry still wasn't home. Now that didn't ring a bell to the father, supposedly, or the mother, assumed he's staying at a neighbor's house. Regardless, this was a school day, school night, school the next day. That didn't raise an alarm. Now when the father came back in the morning at 7 o'clock, Harry still wasn't there. Then supposedly the father got worried. But so, to me, we waited that long time. So they waited till school opened, because they thought, well, maybe he's at the neighbor's house, and he went to school from the neighbor's house. They went to the school, and the school said, he's never showed up today. So that started a search throughout Brookville looking for Harry. They questioned the brother and all his friends, and they said, no, he never came down. Like I said, they looked at that on the right. He could only went 2 ways if he went through that fence. On the right, the newly plowed field, there was no footprints, so he didn't go that way. The brother and his friends said he didn't come and play with us. Some people in town said they saw him, but that was never confirmed. They dynamited the rivers. They heard there was a circus that stopped in town. They tracked them down to Pittsburgh. There was no sign of Harry. About a week later, at the Hellshow house, behind it there was a little barn, and it had been searched 4 or 5 times. His uncle came to help, his brother search for his nephew, and they went out into the barn for some reason, and up in the loft, there was an old trunk up there, and the uncle said, did you look in that trunk? And the father said, well, no, why would we, Now, to get up to the loft was a real narrow, rickety ladder that only very carefully could you get up there. The uncle and the dad went up there, and right away they could smell something, and they went to the trunk. Well, they couldn't get the latches open because they were so rusted, so the father got a knife and popped it, and in there was the body of Harry. He was naked. Underneath his body his clothes were underneath the body. The body would have been like practically impossible. I would say that the trunk was probably as big as that tote there, that gray tote. And he was a full, well-developed 10-year-old, so to get his body in there, it would have took a lot of conniving to put his body in there that way. And then, like I said, this was a week later. It took 3 doctors to get his body out of there.
Wow.
And there was no rigor mortis. So it was just like he just died. They noticed his hair was wet, like slicked back, like if you would, you dunk in the water, go like that, and his hair was wet that way. They finally determined, he didn't drown or anything. They determined he was strangled, and that's the end of the story. They don't know who did it. So that leaves it, to me, open to your imagination. I believe John Benet Ramsey was killed by somebody in the house. To me, there's no doubt. There was nobody outside went in there. With Harry, there's no way if somebody murdered him outside of the house, why would they take him back to his property and stuff him in there, you know? He didn't get in there his own. They said if he had been put in there alive, there was big slits on the sides, so he would have been able to breathe, he would have been able to yell. Houses were close together, they would have been able to solve it, but they never did. So that's the story of Harry.
I would suspect the uncle.
Yeah, you know, somebody did say that, but, you know,
Cause he
There-
said, did you check up in that box up there?
he was a suspect. I suspect father. Because the father said, well, I saw him go out the back gate and, you know, he didn't go to the right because there was no tracks and his brother didn't see him. And then the father not being worried about him not coming home for
Till the
supper.
next day.
Yeah, that to me was suspect. Was Harry.
Yeah, but they used to do not worry about kids, they come back when they got there.
Right. Now, if they had DNA,
Yeah,
They
they
would've
would've
known.
found it.
would have found it. Now I'm gonna go on a little bit different here. Beyond this, the murders, I find a lot of things, interesting cases that aren't murder, or maybe they are, but, so I'm working on a book now, it's called Missing in the Pennsylvania Wilds. And that'll have people missing from all over. These are just a couple interesting cases, like I said, this girl missing from Semahoney. A lot of the ones I've found are not, this is the National Missing and Unidentified Person System. A lot of these people are not on here, you know. There really is no database that you could look at to say who's missing in Cameron County, who's been missing 50 years. They'll never find that. Sometimes the police, I talk to them, they'll have a small list, but it's not comprehensive. So I found a lot of people that are missing that you never know, you know, unless you're related. And in the new book, this is just a couple of cases. This little boy, his name was Sherman Campbell. He lived up by Ulysses, you know, that's his dad, mom, little sister, and they had a brother. In 1902, he went out in the fields. His father saw him, mother saw him go out in the fields to get the cows, to go bring the cows home. He didn't think anything of it, and he's never seen again. One thing, you know, what they say back then a lot of times, oh, he got eaten by a bear or something. Now, there's never been anybody killed by a bear in Pennsylvania. It's never happened. The closest ever was about 20 years ago in Lock Haven. A gentleman was on his farm. He was cutting a tree down, and a tree hit him in the head, knocked him down, injured him, and a bear came along. So there's still disagreement there. The Game Commission said the guy was dead already and the bear ate him. And the coroner down there says, no, the bear killed him while he was injured. But in reality, nobody's ever been.
You probably didn't know it anyways.
Right, but it's never happened, you know. And there was cougars in the 1850s, you know, but, you know, they said, well, he probably got eaten by a bear, you know, and that doesn't happen. Now, there is a case, one of McKean County, a little baby was taken by a bear and eaten in Mount Jewett, 1890 or whatever. That I would believe. You have a little infant laying outside. I think the mother left her outside of the farmhouse. They saw the bear in the neighborhood. That could have happened, but
I usually don't, I mean,
You
babies
don't know
is
what
kind
happened.
I don't know why, but babies, they don't bother babies and stuff.
not usually. You know,
Yeah.
you know, it would be more likely a dog. You
Yeah.
know, but he, like I said, he disappeared and was never found. You'll never find anything about him anywhere. The more recent, this is also in Potter County. This is a tree stump. All right, this guy was 85-year-old David Stevens, Littlemore's Run in Potter County. And this is 1964, so this isn't that long ago. The gentleman, he was 85 years old. He just had a heart attack. He had open heart surgery a year before this incident. He was almost death, and he went hunting with his brother, a couple other gentlemen, up in Moore's Horn. He bought a camp up there, and then they hunted there all the time. Well, he was sitting on his log, squirrel season. He has a shotgun, double-barrel shotgun. He was seen at 3 o'clock on a Saturday. His brother sat over like 100 yards this way all day long, so they could kind of see each other. One of his buddies walked by him, talked to him, said, "Well, I'm gonna, walk around here, and we'll come back." So his buddy went over here, got his brother, and they went around. They got back here an hour later, and he was gone. So I started hollering for him. They couldn't find him. They went back to their car down the hill. Now, this guy, he needs assistance just to get up there, because he couldn't walk very well. They went back to the car, he wasn't there, so they went back and they looked till 6:30 at night, and then they couldn't find him, so they went to the state police. State police, they got a lot of Boy Scouts, the high school students went looking the next day. For weeks, they went, bloodhounds came in, and never found a trace of him, so he's been gone since 1964. Now, a couple theories, but this is such a remote area, but the state police thought, well, maybe he got kidnapped, but he didn't have any money. Yeah, who would go up into the woods and kidnap him?
It's definitely a remote area.
Right.
I got logs over there.
More likely but, why wasn't he found? Why wasn't the gun found? Why wasn't anything? So that's kind of a mysterious, whatever happened there, but he's still missing to this day. But you'll never, if you punch his name into the internet, you'll never find anything about him, that he's missing up there in Potter County. And that brings me to the other boy. In this area not too far away in 1975, a 6-year-old went up there with his family to a camp in Potter County. And the mom and dad went into, I think, Gailton, to the store, and he stayed behind. He said, he was 16, he said, "I'm going to go for a hike." Now this was in Labor Day, or Memorial Day weekend. So it was nice and sunny out. He didn't have a gun or anything. All he had, supposedly, was a camera and a flashlight, and he left. When the parents got home, or back to camp, he wasn't there yet, and they didn't think anything of it. Well, when it became dark, he didn't come back. They looked for him, and then they got the police involved. Massive search, and no sign anywhere for him. But a year later, a hunter was hunting the ridge behind, about a mile and a half behind the camp, up on a hillside, and it was all covered with pine trees. And for some reason or other, he was looking up. I think he was squirrel hunting, actually. And he saw something really weird in the tree, about 12 feet up. And the more he looked at it, he thought, that looks like a body, a skeleton. And he went and got the police, and they went up, and here it was the missing kid. He, officially, what they say is he climbed the tree. He brought a 30-30 with him. Disassembled, he carried it in his bag so his parents didn't know he had him. So he must have planned on suicide. He tied himself to the tree 12 feet up, and then tied the gun to the tree, and then shot himself. Yep, and then the gun hung there, and he hung there for over a year.
Ooh.
Was that Wild Boy?
Yeah, Wild Boy. Yep. But that's a weird one there. People don't usually go through that, to commit suicide. And to climb 12 feet and to tie yourself up there, I don't know. But I'm not sure if I'll have that one. I might have that one. I mean, these ones will be in the new book.
Well, if he decides to kill himself, that would work.
It's just a really mysterious way to do it.
I know.
12 feet, but I do believe that story. This one just doesn't make any sense. Stuff like
He
this.
just wandered off somewhere.
I have a question on that old man mentioning, if he had a gun back then, would there be a serial number that would have been registered?
Mm-hmm.
So could you check to see if anybody's popped up with that
They've,
serial number on that gun?
yeah, I would know. They said there's no record of this, except in old records. There's no active investigation.
Right, but somebody has the serial number
You
of
would-
the family.
You would think,
So then you could do a search on serial numbers of guns being sold wherever.
right,
And would it show up?
So are there any plans to change that for missing persons? Because I know when we lived in Center County, there was one in Lock Haven that
There's
happened, and
lots.
one right in Center Hall when we lived there, and she worked at a bar, and she had like her
Yeah.
supper out,
Yeah.
and she
she'll be in
never.
the new book. Yeah,
So they know
Boots.
she didn't plan to, she just
So
didn't.
you are
leave.
doing Center County.
Yeah, Center's in it.
There's
Center's
three girls
in,
missing, at least from the sixties to the nineties, plus our DA's missing.
yeah, Greco.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I talked to a state police retired from, in Phillipsburg, and he said there's so much more to Ray Ricard's case.
Mhm.
He got to read the case, he
Oh,
said,
yeah.
and he said, you wouldn't believe what really happened, but see, he wouldn't tell me either. you know,
Right.
I think he was
Because he wasn't
on-
allowed to read it either, but he said one of his
Yeah,
buddies
yeah.
told him
I
to read it.
think he was
people aren't telling.
He was on
Yeah.
to a drug ring or something, and they,
More to it, yeah, I mean, he wouldn't tell me, I was like, oh, I thought, well, I was like.
cause they found his laptop or his hard drive or something.
Hard drive was in the river, yeah,
Mhm.
you know. I mean, I'd like to see a database, like, but, you know, I mean, these aren't easy to find. You won't find anything about little Sherman, and you won't find anything in the newspapers either, you know.
Mhm.
You'll see a brief mention that he was lost. His father had connections to the Goodyear Empire. The Goodyears were a big lumber family.
Yep.
They sent a special train down from Buffalo with workers looking for him, and they never found him. But, you know, like, I have cases, well, one of them from Potter County, there's a lot from Potter County. A little boy was snatched, 1890s, it was like 4-year-old little.
I wasn't born yet.
Right, little boy running around Connersport and he disappeared. And it totally devastated his mom and dad. And for the first 5-year anniversary, 10-year anniversary, they were interviewed by the paper, you know. They had meanwhile moved to Buffalo and they broke up and they were just heartbroken. 25 years later, a gentleman in, no, I shouldn't say gentleman, but in Connersport was dying of cancer, and he called a priest in, and he told the priest that back in the 1890s, a wealthy man from New York City had been there, had saw this little boy. The guy from New York City had just lost his little 4-year-old boy to diphtheria. He paid this guy $500 to kidnap that boy and bring him to New York City. And,
Priests aren't allowed to tell that though. How did he find that?
well,
Or not
he
supposed to?
allowed to have the priest. Okay.
I see.
He told the priest, and then he said, the priest said, can I share this? And
Yeah.
so they brought others in.
I know.
Well, I have another one like that too, but, now they did go in 1920 to New York City, they found this boy. His father had died, he was a very wealthy man. He had recollections that he had a different life, but you know, I mean, I can remember things that happened to me 3 years old, 4 years old, because I had a friend, my best friend died, you know, so to me, I can remember it clear as day. A lot of kids, people don't have memories at 3 or 4 years old. He faintly remembered he had a different life, he just didn't know what it meant, so supposedly that's solved. Now, whether it is or not, you know, they didn't do DNA in 1920, is that really the boy that was taken from Potter County, you know? But,
I know back over in Potter County, the potato thing over there, you know, they all had, bring up some guys, immigrants and stuff from Philadelphia. There was a lot of them come up missing.
oh yeah, there's a lot. If you go through the courthouse records, one thing I know is a lot of people that dressed in 3-piece suits that got drunk in the daylight and didn't walk down the sidewalk, they walked in front of a train.
No,
You know, and that, you know, in the 1920s, the teens and that, the coroner wasn't gonna do a big autopsy if you got a mangled body on a train track.
we got another one.
Yeah, so you know that a lot of them, I think they probably strangled them and then threw the bodies on the train tracks, so you never know that. There's a family in, I'm not gonna say, but part of their grocery trade was they had a connection to New York City, and one in the know told me back in the 20s, the mafia or whatever in New York City would send him his vegetables for his store. underneath the ice was bodies, and he buried them. So they're buried not too far from here. Yeah. And I do believe that one.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, it actually came from the family that told me, you know, from the great grandson told me, you know, that's how Papa got all his money.
Yeah.
Now they own lots and lots of land, you know, but that's how they fed him. You know, and that, so there's a lot buried in these mountains,
Huh.
you know. But
A lot of woods places.
a lot of mysteries, you know, too.
Suppose the gold too.
The gold. Now I have
Silver.
in here.
You know how vast this area is. I mean, you could take somebody out in the woods and,
Oh, yeah. I
You
mean,
could put them under a root wall and cut the root wall off and flip them down there. They'd never,
and they find some of them years later, you know.
no, they wouldn't find them.
You're giving me good ideas.
I have like the
I
dense,
know how to do it.
the dense run gold in this one, but you have to use a little bit of conjecture.
Yeah, well, I
Because-
looked all over Dense Run for that. I plowed up every root wall down there.
I don't, it's, my opinion, it doesn't exist. If you look, now the reason I have it in here, I have a murder in here. The guy's name was Connors, Dennis Connors. That's, happens to be almost the same name of the guy that disappeared, you know, that got away. Okay, his name was Connors.
I don't
Actually,
know him.
But, yeah, well, he got murdered in, the hotel's gone now. He got murdered by, a Burke, and,
Probably know him too.
yeah. Well, they own the hardware, they own thousands of acres down there, and the other guy that witnessed it, they own thousands of acres down there now. You know, you're talking, this murder happened in 1870s.
I don't remember him.
So, yeah, so
Relevant.
I mean, you know, whether he told them where the gold was, and they murdered him, I don't know. But if, you know, researching it, I saw gold did go through here,
Oh, yeah, they come down that maybe,
1806.
yeah.
1806 though, wasn't during the Civil War. And there was a guy named Henry Schumacher. He was the state historian for Pennsylvania, and Henry liked to make up stories. And he would do a lot of this lore to bring people to Pennsylvania, because, you know, he talked about the gold, or the silver up here, Parker's silver.
Oh, yeah.
In Gardeau, and he embellished that. Now that one though, you can read in 1880s that was in the paper. So it's not like all of a sudden the Medix Run Gold showed up in 1974.
Well, that up there at Parker Tomb, I lived right there. Right, them people come in there and tear the doors off and everything.
Just, yeah.
Poor old Parker's shattered all over that place.
Yeah,
So
there's no,
my uncle Bruce, or Paul, he went up there and cemented all the doors.
I saw cement, yeah, I mean, that, you know, does that make any sense that they brought that silver all the way from Florida and it ended up there? I don't believe that, but, you know. There is treasure here. I mean, if you read some of the homicides I read about, some of them were bank robbers. They had gold on them.
Well,
It wasn't found when they were caught, so.
When I was in the woods over there, over to, right at the bottom of, what the hell is it? You know where you go up Mount Judd Hill there?
Yeah.
Off to the right up there.
Yeah, I
Claimed
know.
they had a bank robbery and them guys got up there in the cave.
Yeah.
Don't worry, I looked at all of them, so.
Yeah,
But
it was
they-
found long
Long time ago.
Yeah, it's not there. Above Wilcox, there's still some.
Yeah.
There's still some there, you know, but
I looked all over there too.
I found.
I haven't
those.
found a gold yet.
Gold, I found gold rings, I never found gold coins,
No.
you know, but my detector doesn't pick them up. If you turn it down,
Find
it'll
any
pick them up.
watches?
Huh?
Find any
Does
watches?
anybody have any questions? No?
I got lots of stories.
Well,
Check
hey,
out
I
our
like
website.
stories, that's where I get a lot of my
We'd like you
information.
to sign your book.
Yep, and I have the books available here, but,
Do you remember a pharmacist, Robert Bryan, or Brain? Bryan? He hung himself up in Elk County. He was a pharmacist down here.
okay.
They don't know how he died. Do you remember that one? That was in the 80s.
I do remember that happening, I don't remember.
Robert, it was either Brain or Bryan. I want to think Bryan. He had a pharmacist right over here.
Yeah, he was medicine shop.
And anyways, the day before he died, two guys in suit coats came in, yelled at him, and he says, "I don't have it right now." And the next day he hung himself. But that's just a story.
Well, you know.